The 1970s were a period of really intense indie horror. And just a few years before the Texas Chain Saw Massacre was released, Wes Craven, who is now a name in horror, but was then a nobody, made a film called The Last House on the Left. And it was so brutal that I never once considered including it in this series. And so I say that to say that you know, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was thought of by Wes Craven as a really terrifying movie. He said that it looked like someone stole a camera and started killing people. That's how he described his experience of seeing the film. But knowing Craven's Last House on the Left and knowing Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I still chose Massacre because it's got a greater sense of landmark in terms of horror. When I was telling people about which films I was going to use for this course, and I would get to the 1970s and I would say the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, people would respond by saying, I don't actually think that's that scary. It's not really that great of a movie. And I would say, regardless, everybody knows it. You say the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and people kind of go, whether they've seen the film or not. And so it has this notoriety that almost is on the level of like urban legend. When I was a kid, we knew sort of what happened in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What you knew is that there was a crazy guy with a chainsaw massacring people. That's about as much as you needed to know at the time. You knew that it was also something you weren't going to get to see as a kid or as a teenager. I mean, there were all sorts of movies you could get access to, but the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in Canada at least, wasn't one of them. I have a friend who sent me the ratings card, the original ratings card for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in Alberta. We can see that when you take a look at it, you know, October 31st, 1974 is when they received the reel, but the movie the movie wasn't released that year in Alberta. It didn't get a release in 1974. It was made in 1973. But it didn't make its way into Alberta until 74, at which time it was reviewed by the Board of Censors and rejected. And then again in 1976, reviewed by the Board of Censors and rejected. And then again in October of 1981, reviewed by the Board of Censors and again rejected. And it wasn't until November 5th of 1982, so nearly a decade after the movie was made, that it was available in Alberta in wide distribution. Now, that isn't to say that theaters weren't showing the movie, because you could see this film at indie houses, at least in the States, drive-ins, whatnot. But both Canada and Britain, famously Britain, because Britain took a lot longer than Canada to get around to permitting this movie to be shown, had rejected it as a movie that ought to be shown. The Board of Censors, a board in Britain, the British Board of Film Classification, would not give it a green light in England. And so you have a movie that's banned, it immediately takes on this sort of notoriety. And we just look at the paratexts for the movie with these great taglines: who will survive and what will be left of them. I mean, there's an implication of gore. You put that up against chainsaws and massacres, and the mind conjures up the horrors without even having to see the film. You could just look at the paratext. There's something terrifying about Leatherface's anonymity behind that mask, and it's not a clean-cut mask like Michael Myers. It's not a hockey mask like Jason Voorhees. It's a skin mask. It's somebody's face that's been dried out and laid over top, and it's just horrifying because there's this non-face sort of sense to it. the paratext stating what happened is true. This great voiceover at the beginning of the film by none other than John Larroquette, who is probably best known for comedy. The guy was on a sitcom called Night Court for years, playing a smarmy lawyer. But here he is doing this great, deep, resonant voiceover at the beginning of the film that gives us the impression that what we're about to watch is an account of something true, that this actually happened. And the paratexts reinforce that. What happened is true. Now the motion picture, that's just as real. And the people on the British Board of Film Classification certainly seemed to feel that way about the movie. None other than Stephen Murphy, who was the secretary of the board, said that this was a film of considerable merit, that it was not an exploitation film. And what he probably meant by that is that, because in other comments he reveals that he thinks it's a really well-made movie. This is not a terrible film. So it's not exploitation crap. This is not a B film. He's like, no, this is well made. And he said, you know, in agreement, without, you know, knowing that he was agreeing with Wes Craven, Stephen Murphy said this appeared to be a fictionalized documentary. And the deputy to, there was two secretaries, and the deputy to the other secretary, Ken Penry, said, I can admire the expertise with which it is made, but I still find watching it a rather degrading experience, right? And in 1977, there was an attempt in England to censor some of the content, and they realized that to some degree, the movie was censor-proof, because it was not individual scenes. This concept of who will survive and what will be left of them makes us think that we're going to be seeing chunks of meat. And I mean, we do see chunks of meat, but it's never like prosthetic limbs or anything like that. We'd have to wait for Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 for that to be the focus of the film. But they tried taking out individual scenes, what they felt was the most explicit violence. But it wasn't the problem. That wasn't the problem. And James Rose talks about this in his Devil's Advocates book on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that they took these scenes out, and the British Board of Film Classification still said no, because it was the overarching feel of the film. It was what Penry was saying when he said, I still find watching it a rather degrading experience, that it's not the individual scenes of explicit violence, because as we're about to find out, are they really explicit? It was the sense of this nightmare vision, this sort of senseless, motiveless malice of the film that pervades it from, you know, the moment that Leatherface steps on screen, really, because I don't know. Well, I suppose the moment they pick up the hitchhiker, it really starts. But I think they get down to business when Leatherface finally comes on screen. But it wasn't the particular moments; it was its entirety. And they cited in particular the relentless torture of Sally at the end of the film. But that tagline, who will survive and what will be left of them, let's take a look at the moment that Pam gets hung on the hook, because that's right there in that paratext of the poster for the film. Leatherface in the foreground, revving up the chainsaw, Pam in the background screaming. This is a painting. We don't necessarily get a shot like this in the film, although it mirrors one of the shots in some ways. But because Pam is unseen in this poster, and there's a little bit of blood on the wall behind her, there's a sense in which we may actually see, you know, this woman being dismembered by a chainsaw when we go to see the movie. You know, what will be left of them. So we analyze this great shot. It's one of the, in terms of film brilliance, just technical brilliance and excellence, the shot where Pam walks up to the house is outstanding. They had to build a dolly track that ran underneath the swing set, and there's a great big beautiful blue sky above it, giving this sense of everything is normal, everything's okay. Pam and Kirk were on their way to find a swimming hole to just enjoy themselves on this beautiful day. And the house is white and it's pristine, and what could possibly go wrong, right? We already know because we've seen that Kirk got smashed with a hammer. But Pam approaches the house, and it's this moment that we might think of as being, sexualizing Pam, that this is a moment of male gaze. And there's no doubt that an audience member certainly could feel that. But Tobe Hooper talks about this and says, and there's a few film scholars who have taken a look at it too and said, we don't think this is about sexualizing Pam. It's more about exposing the body as potential meat. Because if, we expose her back here, then that scene with the hook becomes more horrifying because it's the naked flesh that it's going to be biting into. And so her near nudity is more about exposing the flesh, as it were. We might say, well, why didn't they do it with the male? Absolutely. There is, there's always going to be that lingering, well, I don't know about that entirely, but, let's go with it, because what is this scene setting up? Is it setting up a moment of titillation? No, it's setting up a scene of horror. And so she approaches the house. Again, we don't have any sense of foreboding other than, the awareness that Kirk has died, but the way that the camera shot is handling this has us approaching almost like we're coming up to that house that, everybody says is haunted, and Pam's gutsy enough to walk all the way up, and we're too chicken, so we stay back as the camera. Leatherface comes out and grabs her. Gunnar Hansen, playing Leatherface, is such a massive physical presence. He literally envelops the actress playing Pam and then drags her into this room. And the shot brings us that hook right up in the foreground. So, we move from a really great use of both cinematography and mise en scène to the mise en scène of a meat hook and the cinematography of a close-up of that hook with Leatherface and Pam approaching it. Then Leatherface hoists her up, and this is where editing takes over. He hoists her up, gives her that jump, and then it cuts to the moment of him getting ready to put her on the hook. The magic of editing moves us to the other side of the camera as the actress is lowered with a harness, parachute harness, onto the hook, and we now know that the character of Pam has been, impaled by this thing. Theater goers were convinced they saw the hook go in. They were convinced they saw the hook go in. In the same way that theater goers thought they were seeing the cat pursuing Alice in Cat People, Val Lewton's Cat People in the 1940s, they were convinced they saw the hook. And so this is an interesting intersection of what Julian Hainich calls direct horror and suggestive horror. Now, most of what we get with the Texas Chain Saw Massacre is direct horror. This movie does not hide its killer. When Leatherface comes out, it's sudden, he's in full view. We don't necessarily fully get what's going on, but they're not hiding him. He's not a hidden Catwoman. He's this immediate physical presence. Bashes Kirk over the head. Then immediate physical presence, direct horror, grabs Pam, puts her on a hook. But there is a way in which Tobe Hooper is playing with elements of suggestive horror here, where the horror is not seen directly. Now, the horror of Leatherface, that's absolutely direct horror. The horror of the hook, direct horror. The horror of impalement, suggestive. And the scene keeps doing this. Now, there's blood all over the wall behind Pam. but it's all dried blood. That's all part of the mise en scène. It's not part of the action. She's not spurting arterial blood out of her back. But the actress gives us the impression of her pain through her facial expressions and this agonizing close-up. There is a mix here of direct and suggestive horror that is arguably more powerful. And I say this because we now have Texas Chain Saw Massacre remakes to look at. And we can see, like, they do it all with, you know, all the gore that they can give you in a post-prosthetic, post-digital age where we've mastered so many different techniques of showing graphic, horrific violence in torture porn, in modern slashers, the Evil Dead remake, just intense levels of explicit gore. For myself, I don't know that I'm ever scared or horrified by these things so much repulsed or sickened or disgusted. And those are certainly part of direct horror. But I think that what Tobe Hooper accomplished with the Texas Chain Saw Massacre is ultimately more refined in a way that makes it continue to feel horrific years later. Even the use of the chainsaw is largely suggestive horror. It's direct in the representation of it within the mise en scène. Here's a chainsaw, the chain, you know, and it's moving and it's making those noises, and that's great. The use of sound in this film is amazing. From the soundtrack, which is very upsetting at points, to the use of the sound of the chainsaw, Marilyn Burns' screams as Sally, relentless screaming. The sound is phenomenal. But here, Leatherface gets ready to, you know, take the chainsaw to Kirk's corpse. And apparently Gunnar Hansen was just a terror on the set. And he sort of takes almost a crazy glee in recounting stories of scaring his castmates. The actors who played the young hippie teens, college age young people, they were all really, like, they didn't hang out with Gunnar. They didn't talk to him apparently. And I guess, you know, when he went to take the chainsaw, he just said to the actor who was playing Kirk, like, don't move your head. Like, he would always do things that were a little or a lot unsettling. But we don't actually see the chainsaw bite into Kirk. We just see Pam on the hook, Leatherface bringing the chainsaw down. It's all suggested. We don't actually see it happening, but audiences were convinced that they did. Audiences were convinced that they saw intense graphic horror in this film. But there's this, you know, this amazing back and forth use of direct versus suggestive horror. Interestingly, apparently, I don't know how much stock I put in any of this stuff that the cast and crew say, but there are a few sources that corroborate Tobe Hooper saying that he'd really wanted to get a PG rating for the film. And that the non-graphic use of the hook was the way to get there. I don't know. But it certainly, in hindsight, is an effective use of suggestive horror mixed with direct horror. So here's the question. If this film doesn't have exceedingly graphic violence, then why was the British Board of Film Classification so loath to give it a green light that it was banned in Britain until March 16th, 1999. 1999. So Canada had already had it for a decade and a half at this point, or Alberta at the very least. So what was it about the Texas Chain Saw Massacre that kept the British censors from giving it the green light? And I want to tell you about this book series because it's fantastic. It's called The Devil's Advocates. and it's from Autor Press. And they publish these little monographs, very much like the BFI film classics that I've been telling you about in previous instances of these lectures. But these ones are just horror, just focused on horror, and they're quite good. I'm not enamored with James Rose's not everything that he says. I think there's some really good information in the book. But, you know, he tries to tie it to earlier sort of the prehistory of horror, which is always tied to the Gothic genre, which is a respectable area of study for academics. Horror is not a respectable area of study for academics. I am not a respectable academic. And whenever you have a genre that is not respected by the larger sphere of academic inquiry, academics who are interested in that will try to align it with something that is already being studied. And so in the case of James Rose, he connects Texas Chain Saw Massacre to the Gothic genre and to Freud's theory of the uncanny. And I can't count how many times I've seen Freud's theory of the uncanny showing up in studies of horror. I took a course on Gothic fiction in my undergraduate work, and we did Freud's uncanny. And our prof was really, really big into horror, and he flat out said, I wish I could be doing a course on horror, but they won't let me do that, so we'll do Gothic, which is sort of like doing horror. And, at the time, I was like, oh, the Freud's uncanny, so great. And I just, more and more, I'm not convinced of its usefulness in viewing horror, at the very least. I mean, there are some things about it. We're not going to get into it today, but I just basically saying that, Rose and other academics and I don't know James Rose, so I can't say that he always does this, but in the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, he spends quite a bit of time trying to read Texas Chain Saw Massacre through the lens of the Gothic. And in particular, he cites David Puntner and Glenys Byron's book, The Gothic, which argues that despite the diverse range of definitions for the Gothic genre, and that's another thing that's sort of endemic to academia, is that we can't agree on how to define anything, there is a persistence of motifs. And Rose focuses on 3 of these motifs or parameters. There are many more that Puntner and Byron talk about, but Rose focuses down on these 3. And again, this feels very much to me like the many arguments that I've seen where an academic will take a modern genre like fantasy or science fiction, and they will align it with some previous bit of critical theory or an approach to, classifying literature, and then that just gets stuck in there forever, whether or not it's useful. I can also think of Vladimir Prop's taxonomy of fairy tales and how that got utilized over and over again in fantasy studies, and it isn't always as useful as you get the impression it is. And that is a little bit of how I feel about Rose's use of Gothic motifs. You might be like, well, why are you using it then if it's not very good? Well, because he gets somewhere that is worth paying attention to. It's just that he takes a little while to get there, as I am doing today in this incredible ramble. But he's got these 3 Gothic motifs. The haunted castle, which is represented in the film by the ruined Hardesty house, this ancestral home. Right there, that's part of the Gothic, that there's an ancestral home. It's Sally and Franklin's ancestral home. And we know this because, Sally is initially not afraid of the Hardesty house. She's walking around and she has these good memories of it. The reason that I'm not particularly fussed about this particular reading is that the action doesn't take place in the Hardesty house. The action takes place over at the farmhouse. The shooting the footage at the Hardesty house is a setup to the horror that we're about to get. It's a step in the direction. It's how we get the teenagers within spitting distance of Leatherface and his family, of this cannibal family. And then there's the Gothic motif of the monster. But really, honestly, do we need the Gothic as a framework to know that horror includes monsters, or that this film has a monster? I just, it feels like, why are we even making this comparison? Do we really need to go back to the 19th century to understand what the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is doing? Or, as I say, is this just a way of aligning it with prevalent academic readings? And then we get to the persistent, there's a lot of, sort of mental torture for the characters in the Gothic. We get this element of persecution and paranoia. And boy, I tell you, we get that in spades in this film. And so, Rose says that, as Rose puts it, he says that the Gothic is intrinsic to interpreting the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't know that we need the Gothic to do that, but what Rose derives from this motif of persecution and paranoia in the Gothic is worth attention, because, and this is the most illuminating idea that Rose's approach produces, is that characters in the Gothic are subject to violence or pursuit for, and here's the term, incomprehensible reasons. That characters in the Gothic are subject to violence or pursuit for incomprehensible reasons. And that, I think, is what ties us back to Ken Penry's statement about, admiring the expertise with which this movie is made, but watching it being a degrading experience. That this is a film of considerable merit, appears to be a fictional documentary, but as Wes Craven said in more perhaps visceral language, it looked like someone stole a camera and started killing people. And Kim Newman, in his book Horror, the definitive companion to the most terrifying movies ever made, says, "No explanation is offered for the condition of the family, a funhouse reflection of both their victims and the nuclear family of TV sitcoms, but their grotesque habits and appearance, from Leatherface's mask of human skin to Grandpa's parchment features, are somehow utterly credible." And he refers to Hooper's use of nightmare logic. So Kim Newman saying no explanation is offered for any of what's going on here. So we have this idea of incomprehensible reasons. That this is all happening, but it's happening like it happens in a nightmare. When you try to explain it to people the next morning, you say, and then suddenly this happened. And I think it was happening because of this, but I'm not sure. It was a dream. And for Sally Hardesty, this certainly takes on that nightmarish aspect. But every step of the way, it's like that. Kirk's death, incomprehensible reasons. Kirk walks into the house. He sees all those animal trophies, skulls on the wall. I think as an audience, I know that for myself, the first time I saw this movie, I was like, what? What am I seeing? Oh, okay, those are a bunch of animal skulls. And it up against that red background. WTF, what's going on here? We want to know, who lives here? What do they do? And I mean, because of the notoriety of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we're probably aware it's a cannibal family. But we have to try to be that sympathetic viewer and think, what would it have been like to see this for the first time? What's going on here? Have we ever seen anything like this? Yeah, sure, there'd been, monstrous hillbilly families. There'd been cannibalism, Night of the Living Dead. But had we seen it were we seeing it all like this? No. We're audiences seeing it, and then Kirk trips, he steps up, and the movie doesn't care to go, let me tell you about this character's backstory, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake would. Just Leatherface steps out, bam, hits him with a hammer, and it's the suddenness, the immediacy of this brutality is just so shocking. I mean, this might be one of Julian Haynich's moments of cinematic shock. It's not quite a jump scare. I don't think you go, whoa, but you are like, what? Because it happens so fast. Bashes him over the head, and then the actor playing Kirk doing the flop, as he's going into convulsions. That's just so disturbing. And yet we as the audience, like the characters, have no clue why this is happening. And we've already got all sorts of mysteries running around in our head from the opening of the film with those weird flashbulb shots of the exhuming of these corpses, and then the corpses being aligned in this weird artwork that gets mirrored once we get to Leatherface's home. I guess this is arts and crafts for the hitchhiker. Is this just what he does? He just arranges all of this stuff into these bone sculptures. And that's what he's been doing out at the graveyard as well. The film never tells us. So incomprehensible reasons over and over again. When Pam comes into that room, the actress's face, her facial expressions are telling us, even if we aren't, like, you know, because when we're watching old horror movies, we might already know what's up. You know, it's like knowing the jam about Luke's father in Star Wars. We may already know, but we can tell from the way that this film is constructed that what this movie was communicating to original audiences is sheer, you know, confusion. As she looks at all these different sculptures, and some of them are really, really disturbing. You know, the horn shoved through the human skull. What's up with that? It's, you know, and there are readings of this stuff. Again, people, you know, will get all crazy with the readings. And I'm like, it's meant to horrify. Bottom line, it's meant to horrify. There isn't a lot of, you know, there isn't a lot of political subtext going on here. There are people who think there is. And some of the marketing for the film even said this film's really about Watergate. I have no idea how you would tie this film to Watergate. It certainly maybe played on an America that was reeling from the Vietnam War and the assassinations of major political figures in the late 60s and the Watergate scandal. But this film is not really about Watergate. How do you get there? Even the readings where they're like, you know, this is this film that is interrogating the nuclear family in America. Yeah, it's an inversion, but it's an inversion meant for this sort of horror. It's not necessarily a nuanced exploration of those things. There's even readings where they, you know, sort of like there's a sympathy for this family that's been forced into cannibalism because their livelihood has been taken away from them. And I'm like, I think you're going too far. We get the moment of Pam being in the freezer, you know, and again, who's that incomprehensible to? Not to the audience. The audience, you know, knows what's up now, but it's Jerry. Jerry has no idea what's going on, right? Remember, the characters in the Gothic are subject to violence or pursuit for incomprehensible reasons. So all of a sudden, out of the blue comes Leatherface again. He smashes Jerry over the head, and then even more confusingly, Leatherface starts to freak out. What's he upset about? What's the problem? You know, and the filmmakers have said that perhaps what was going through Leatherface's head at this point is, where are all these people coming from? I think that might have even been Gunnar Hansen saying, I was trying to figure out how to play out this scene. But all of this just contributes to this ongoing sense of this chaos of torture, really. Torture, chaos of brutal violence and torture. Franklin, Sally's brother, in the wheelchair. He's just going through the woods, turns on the flashlight. Leatherface comes out, grinds him up. No explanation. And say, like, I will kill you because you did such and such. There's no, like, hey, you took away the meat industry from us, so let me, you know, I mean, there's a subtext to that throughout the film. But I think that has more to do with building a sense of what, you know, this family is still in the meat business, as it were. That there's that macabre humor that runs throughout this movie that Tobe Hooper was quite frustrated with audiences for not getting. It's like he did the horror so well that none of his comedy bits really worked, you know, like, look at what you did to the door. That's supposed to be funny, but I think we're just so emotionally gutted by that point in the movie that there's no way that, I mean, if we laugh, it's more that nervous laughter that you do after something really horrifying happens. So certainly there is this incomprehensibility to the nature of the horror of Texas Chain Saw Massacre, and I think that that is one of the things that drives the overarching feel of the film that the British Board of Film Classification couldn't censor without reducing the film to further incomprehensibility. There was no way to cut out what made this film difficult, what made this film something that they wanted to ban, something that is still disquieting to viewers to this day. I have friends who are big horror fans. They watch this movie and they're like, that movie is just so disturbing. And here again, I've already talked about Julian Hainich a few times today, but I want to return to Hainich's ideas on these types of cinematic fear, because I think they're so incredibly useful for understanding Texas Chainsaw Massacre, especially when we understand how long some of these modes are sustained for in this movie. So we get terror, and Hainich says that terror derives from the quick and loud, perceptible temporal approach of a horrifying threat. So this is connected to direct horror, but now it's different because it's not like the horror is there and it's standing in front of you. It's standing behind you, as empathizing, sympathizing viewer with the person who's being chased. So even though it's not a first-person perspective, in fact, this is where, you know, when we wonder, like, why doesn't first-person perspective work as well as the third-person omniscient perspective of the camera in, say, a chase scene? Because it's just mostly nauseating to have someone run through the woods with a camera. But if we have the quick and loud, perceptible temporal approach of a horrifying threat behind an actress who is running towards us, then consequently we as the film viewer feel like, oh God, that shit's coming towards me. It's getting closer. Like, and oh, run away, run away, run away. That's terror. Hainich's concept of terror is us going run, but it's quite frequently coming directly at us. There's so many shots in this movie where Marilyn Burns as Sally runs towards us, and along comes, you know, Leatherface with that chainsaw right behind her. Hainich says, even if the outcome of the scene is as yet uncertain, a negative ending seems highly probable, since the source of the danger draws near perceptibly and is therefore a known quantity to us, the viewers. And just think about how much of a known quantity Leatherface is at this point. The suddenness with which he killed Kirk and Jerry, the brutality of Pam's being hung on a hook and then shoved into a freezer. We don't have a lot of hope for Sally. And in the wake of horror viewers having seen the utterly bleak ending of Night of the Living Dead and the brutality of Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, they might have been sitting in that theater going, I don't think she's going to make it. And so we've got terror. Because this isn't Tom Cruise running away from explosions. This is a vulnerable woman running away from a monstrous assailant. So it generates this sense of terror. And she just, you know, and this again is one of the things that Kim Newman talks about in his book on horror, that this nightmare logic, you know, Leatherface eternally at Sally's heels as she flees, but never quite catching up with her, right? As he cuts through the door. That's nightmare imagery. That's just absolutely terrifying, that we would close a door and feel safe. We've gotten into a home. We as the viewer are sitting there going, wrong house. You should not have gone in that one. You know, find another house to run inside. Leatherface cutting through the door. She, you know, going upstairs, finding the desiccated grandfather and the mummified grandmother, and then jumping out a window. Like, Sally jumps out of 2 windows in this movie. She's just like, she's so terrified. It's like, get me out of here. And Tobe Hooper has said that, and so has the actress Marilyn Burns, that there are lots of references to this. So there's a good deal of certainty that she worked herself up into actual hysterics filming these scenes. That what we're seeing on the screen At some point, it's how the body works. You get an emotion running through you long enough, and you just can't back it off. And Marilyn Burns really sells terror through these scenes. And just when we think she's fine, as Kim Newman puts it, Sally escaping only to be dragged back to her captors. Right? She gets to the gas station. She thinks she's safe, and then we find out that the guy who runs the gas station is in on the whole thing, and he beats her up with this broom, and that's a super uncomfortable scene too. There's disparate accounts as to whether or not it was Marilyn Burns' idea to just go ahead and actually hit her with the broom so that they could get the take and just have it over and done with, because they kept trying to do it in a sort of stage fighting way. But it is such an uncomfortable scene, because there's something almost not more uncomfortable. A chainsaw is ridiculously uncomfortable, but there's something really unsettling about the way she's beaten by the broom. I guess it's the glee in the actor's face as he beats her with the broom. He does such a good job of vacillating back and forth between this guy who's like, everything's going to be okay, and everything's normal, and we're just going for dinner, and then he's, hitting her with the broken broom handle in the car. And what we get at this point from Hainich's breakdown of types of cinematic fear is dread. Dread is an intense but quiet, anticipatory type of cinematic fear in which we both feel for the endangered character and fearfully expect a threatening outcome that promises to be shocking and or horrifying to us. So while we had terror because we could see the monster approaching, now the monster's right there with her in the cab of the car, or of the truck. And then she's going to be sitting at the foot of the table with all the monsters, Hitchhiker, Leatherface, and, Cook. We can refer to him as Cook. And so we sit there with this quiet, anticipatory type of cinematic fear. Now, quiet, by way of comparison to Marilyn Burns screaming while she's running. Now it's just Marilyn Burns screaming while she's strapped to a chair that's made out of, the arms of the chair are literally the arms of some corpse. These really unsettling close-ups that Hooper uses, and I'm using Hooper generally, he had a cinematographer. But these incredible close-ups, really, really unsettling. And I know from watching movies like this with people that they'll sometimes go, why do they keep showing her eyes so close up? So weird. It's unsettling. It's so creepy to have these really intense close-ups of her eye as it dodges around. I think it intensifies the fear, and yet at the same time, what are we seeing? We're just seeing a woman's eye. But because of the context of this incomprehensibility of the horror and the nightmare logic with which this film operates, it becomes as terrifying in many ways as Pam being hung on a hook. And then we see what the eye sees. These, we've got these close-ups of this terrified eye, and then the camera flips to give us that perspective, and we see all three of those monsters, and they aren't fanged, they aren't Karloff lumbering towards the camera, they aren't even the zombies of Romero. They're humans, and they are not supernatural in any way. There is something extraordinary about Leatherface in that Leatherface has all of these different masks, doesn't speak. There's a thing that Rose talks about with monsters, that they that the monster really, once the monster speaks, it sort of loses its monstrosity. And while Leatherface tries to communicate, it's not speech per se, right? But those masks, these horrifying masks, especially this one where it looks like Leatherface got prettied up because they had company for dinner. Really, really disquieting. And the smiles on the faces of the other actors in this scene, the laughter, the maniacal laughter, and the sound works really well here too, because it's not perfectly paired with the shots. It's like there's a sort of disjointed nature to the sound and the edits and the imagery, but it all feels of a piece. The actor playing Hitchhiker being right up in her face, his glee, I mean, it's straight up glee at the screaming, right? And we jump back and forth between those things until that dread has grown fully in us, and then they drag her over to be cattle, and to have Grandpa smash her over the head with this hammer. And friends of mine who are big horror fans say that this scene, this is the one that does them in, because there's something just so awful about the way that it's not working, how pathetic it is in some ways, and the torture that this woman has endured. Super, super difficult content to work through. But I wonder about another possible way of reading this film with that nightmare logic in place. And this brings us up to a concept that Carol Clover is the originator of, and it's been developed since. Carol Clover's original exploration of it was a bit narrow, but it's been worked with over and over again. But it's this idea of the final girl. And there are those who say that Sally Hardesty is the first final girl. There are others who would say she's not, because she doesn't fit Clover's ideas of confrontation and defeat. You know, Sally needs a woodsman, as it were, to save her. And here's where I'm interested in something that Makita Brotman, in her book Offensive Films Towards an Anthropology of Cinema Vomitif, says about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. She links it to a bunch of fairy tales. And so she links it to, and these were some of the fairy tales that were running through my head as well, that there's a certain amount of Hansel and Gretel. And as it turns out, Tobe Hooper and Kim Henkel, when they were revising the screenplay, went back to a sort of fairy tale roots of horror, because they were originally going to update Hansel and Gretel. And that's what we get, isn't it? Someone lost, to a degree. I mean, they're not really lost, but they didn't really know what they were in for. Coming up to the house that the monster lives inside. It's not made of candy or gingerbread, but it's a very pretty house. Looks inviting. Maybe they'll have, you know, what we need. We need some gas, right? But there's also a relationship with Goldilocks, that you come into the house and you're not supposed to be in the house, and then the denizens come back, and we've got 3 of them even in this particular reading. Goldilocks and the 3 bears, except these 3 bears, while they are a family, there is certainly a sort of Papa Bear. What is Cook? Is he an uncle? Is he an older brother? Is he the dad? We don't know. Again, incomprehensible. Leatherface certainly seems to be fulfilling a lot of the roles of an absent mother. Works in the kitchen, domestic duties, is, you know, coded in sort of female attire at several points. And then Baby Bear, the hitchhiker, maybe, you know. I wouldn't want to go too far with any of that. There's also some Little Red Riding Hood here, you know, as you get lost in the woods and the big bad wolf wants to eat you up. Pieces. We might say the same thing that Rose was saying about persistence of motifs. But fairy tales, at least in their modern sanitized versions, end happily. The original Grimm's tales and pre-Charles Perrault tales, although some of the Perrault tales also end badly, but those are all about morality tales. Learn yourself a lesson. Modern fairy tales, they end happily. But like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, at least at this point in its history, fairy tales don't give complex psychological reasons for why the wolf wants to eat you, and neither does Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And on the subject of the happy versus unhappy ending, we've got Andrew Tudor's nodes of secure and paranoid horror. And the secure horror is when you kill the monster and it's dealt with and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And paranoid, or I would say insecure horror, is when the monster hasn't been defeated and now it's out there. And I read a psychological study of modern fairy tales where they didn't kill the big bad wolf. They just left it, you know, in the story, like, you know, and Little Red Riding Hood or the woodman scared the big bad wolf away. And the children were more terrified by that ending because that means the wolf is still out there. And I think what we get with Texas Chainsaw Massacre is this fairy tale logic, this fairy tale narrative structure attached to documentary realism, cinema verite. And the combination of those things is really, really potent because the narrative is familiar. The narrative is very familiar as fairy tale sort of logic, fairy tale ideas. And then instead of ending the way that, you know, fairy tales do, I mean, we do get a rescue. We do get a rescue. Up comes the trucker, woodsman number 1, and then the truck, woodsman number 2, to rescue our little Red Riding Hood. Covered in blood. I mean, there's a sort of nod in some ways to the way that the protagonist of the film, The Descent, looks at the very end, covered in blood. And hysterical. Is she really okay? Has she really been rescued? Is she really a survivor? So many things that we don't know. This film doesn't give us a grand sense of closure. Its ending is in many ways related to that idea of incomprehensible reasons for the torture that has occurred, or even what the outcome is at the end. We don't really get the cathartic release of Sally killing the monster, as, you know, Jamie Lee Curtis does in the first Halloween movie. So bringing it back to the final girl. The final girl has a strong relationship with Little Red Riding Hood in many ways. At least modern iterations of Little Red Riding Hood, like Roald Dahl's, where she, you know, is packing a gun and has a wolfskin bag at some point. Because Leatherface isn't dead. The only one who's died is Hitchhiker. Cook's still back at the house. So's Grandpa. And this final image of Leatherface dancing with his chainsaw. Secure versus insecure horror. The monster is still out there. So is she a final girl? I would say this is proto final girl. I think we're taking steps. We're almost there. We're almost at the point where we're going to get Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween, and we're going to get Sigourney Weaver in Alien, and then on and on and on until, you know, today we have this expectation of final girls, like that they're an assumed trope of horror, and, you know, we're gonna get to see how horror plays with some of those things in some of our later movies. But this is a moment where the monster doesn't get dealt with, even in the way that they you know, that you had back in the Universal days, where Frankenstein's monster, you know, dies, but the audience kind of goes, oh, they'll figure out a way to bring him back. They'll figure out a way to bring him back. This was before we had that kind of franchise with this sort of horror. This was not a franchise yet. This was a single instance of horror, and it was different from other horror in so many ways. But I think it's this mix of the incomprehensible reasons attached to this fairy tale nightmare logic, rendered in an ultimately cinema verite documentary fashion, which made this movie so awful. Wasn't any sort of explicit gore, because we really don't get that much, if any. And a little bit of blood splatter when Franklin gets chainsawed, but not a lot of direct gory horror in this film. We would have to wait for Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 to get that kind of brutality. And we're gonna talk about that kind of prosthetic body horror when we get to John Carpenter's The Thing. But before we get to The Thing, we're going to take a look at another sort of family horror, and that doesn't mean horror that's made for the family, but horror that's about the family, next time with William Friedkin's gentrification of the horror film, giving it some legitimacy that you wouldn't even need to go searching for the Gothic or searching for Freud's Uncanny to talk about, with The Exorcist. Next time on Triple Bladed Sword.